Hey everyone, it's Saoirse, and today I want to talk to you about a book that I read so fast because I loved it. It is Consider This by Chuck Palahniuk. Moments in my writing life after which everything was different. So I have to say, this was published in 2021 by the way, I have to say that, I have a master's degree in creative writing. I think I learned more from this book, from the one day or so that I spent reading this book, than I did in my master's degree. So take that as a very strong endorsement. I think this has so much to offer. Even if you're not into writing, it's still a super fascinating book. So let's get into it. I want to read you the back real quick. Oh, but before I do that, can I just say that one time somebody commented on one of my videos and said this must be her dad's bookcase because there's no way she reads Chuck Palahniuk? Like, no way that I had read Fight Club or something? Yeah. If you're gonna be offensive, just hop off my channel. That is nonsense. I've read so much Palahniuk. I don't have all the books I read because I borrowed a lot of them from my sister, but as a teenager I was going through like a lot of his books, and after reading this I want to get back into them because I can't even tell you how amazing this was. Okay. This spellbinding blend of memoir and insight from one of America's most inventive and transgressive authors offers stories and generous advice on what makes writing powerful and what makes for powerful writing. Through years of careful study and a keenly observed life, Palahniuk shares practical advice pulled from the classics, his own work, and his kitchen table MFA, culled from an evolving circle of beloved authors and artists. Packed with anecdotes, memories from the road, moving tributes, and much more, Consider This is Chuck Palahniuk's clear-eyed, sensitive, and illuminating love letter to stories and storytellers, booksellers and books, and writers and readers. As a vivid meditation on challenging readers and on writing at the razor's edge of contemporary fiction, Consider This is the perfect addition to any writer's toolkit and any reader's collection. And I definitely agree. So in this book, it's sectioned into these bits that are all elements of writing. Take a look at that. And I have to say, it's so well structured that I never felt like lost or that the book lost its flow as it was going. It was just so perfectly laid out, and he intersperses these little chapters called Postcards from the Road and tells us bits about his life as a writer and things, extraordinary things that have happened to him. And it's just so well done. I can't say it enough. So this first section about writing it's called Textures. And I'm going to pull out some of the advice that he gives, and then the next half of the video will be about personal stories that he told. So I thought I'd structure it like that, so if you're interested in the writing stuff and not the other stuff, then you only have to watch the first part, vice versa. So in Textures, he recommends that you use description, instruction, and exclamation, so that you mix all of these things in one passage. So for example, he says most fiction consists of only description, but good storytelling can mix all three forms. For instance, a man walks into a bar and orders a margarita. Easy enough. Mix 3 parts tequila and 2 parts triple sec with 1 part lime juice, pour it over ice, and voila, that's a margarita. Using all three forms of communication creates a natural conversational style. Description combined with occasional instruction and punctuated with sound effects or exclamations. It's how people talk. And that's something, if you've read his books, that is so clear in everything he does. He writes in this natural way that is almost bizarre to read because we're not used to reading prose or dialogue written naturally, because it's usually I don't know, there's not really a great way to describe it because I was going to say artistic, but he definitely is artistic. And it's not really forced. You know what I mean. there are certain ways to write that are more natural than others, and a lot of writers keep away from the really natural way because it sounds weird because we're not used to it. We're used to things being a bit more polished, I think. Okay. He also talks about mixing first, second, and third person points of view. Think of a good joke. Think of a good joke. Yesterday I walked into a bar. You know how it goes. You walk into a bar and you expect a bartender, maybe some video poker. A man needs his distractions. No guy wants to get off work and go into some bar and see a penguin mixing drinks. It says, in conversation we switch between first, second, and third person points of view. The constant shift controls the intimacy and authority of our story. For instance, I walked has the authority of first person. Second person addresses the listeners and enlists them. You walk. And the shift to third person controls the pace. No guy wants, by moving from the specific I to the general guy. I think that's such good advice. My head was kind of going nuts while I was reading this because I was thinking of how I could apply this to something I write, and it also made me think, like, have I just been writing horrible crap forever? I don't know. It's fascinating because he's been writing for many years, but the way that he's able to lay out everything so clearly, and it's in such a useful way, I really envy that, because if people ask me how to write, I'm just like, I don't know, just try. But he breaks it down into this science that I don't think I could ever do. Okay, also in textures is attribution. Use attribution to control the delivery of dialogue, creating the sort of dramatic pause an actor would insert. Otherwise, the reader will race through a line without realizing how it ought to be weighted. Now, this is a good point, because he talks about this, I think he calls it like tennis match dialogue, where it's just line of dialogue from the other person, line of dialogue from the other person, and then it just keeps going. And I know I always have to go back and be like, who is saying what, to like count, like, okay, every other one is this person, and that's ridiculous. And then, as he says, it doesn't allow the words to have their proper weight. So he says, third, use physical action as a form of attribution that also underscores or undermines what's being said. For example, coffee. With her back to the room, she poured the cups full and dropped cyanide in Ellen's. I think you'll like this new French roast. So that creates tension by pitting your character's gestures against his or her words. I really like that. Because you wouldn't think typically to write this way. What I really love is an unreliable narrator. That's always my favorite thing. And so this idea of having gestures that counteract the words that are being said, that really resonated with me. Where am I? Oh yeah, so this is very important. He says, in short, dialogue is your weakest storytelling tool. As Tom Spanbauer always taught us, language is not our first language. I love that concept. And it really struck me because I have always been insecure about my dialogue in my writing. I've been told it's the weakest thing about my writing. I know it's the weakest thing. I don't like writing dialogue. I prefer to write prose for days that is just, paragraphs of description and internal thoughts, and I just don't like. One of my favorite books has not a single line of dialogue in it. I don't care for dialogue. So I felt kind of validated that he said that. And that idea that language is not our first language is so interesting because he talks so much about using the character's body language, using the way that they move in a space to further the story. And I'm not sure if I highlighted this part, but he says that using dialogue as a way to further the plot is lazy and don't do it. Which I just had to like wrap my brain around because I was like, can it be? I just always, I always felt so bad about my dialogue, so I felt really great about that. Let's see. Alright. This is the last thing in textures that I'll mention. So he talks about using a social model, depicting a social model through repetition. So repeating kind of the same structure throughout the book to sort of give readers a way to expect things. Okay, it says to heighten this ritual effect, consider creating a template chapter. Using one existing chapter, change minor details, and make it arrive at a fresh epiphany. Chances are the reader won't realize what you've done, but will unconsciously recognize the repeated structure. Use this template to create 3 chapters placed equal distances apart in the book. Pretty interesting concept. And as somebody who really likes structure, I always write from a loose outline and kind of know what's the main idea of each chapter, because I come from academic writing and writing outlines and research papers and blah blah blah. I love the idea of having that rhythm also as somebody who writes and appreciates writing that is more poetic than action based. It's more about the language. I really love the idea of having that clear rhythm that maybe isn't so clear that the reader will think about it and overthink it, but they just kind of flow with the book because it has this structure. Okay, the next section is establishing your authority. And the first bit in there that I'll mention is physical verbs. Action carries its own authority. If you move through each scene with clear physical verbs, taking steps, touching objects, your reader's mind will follow as closely as a dog's eyes track a squirrel. If you were my student, I'd ask you to consider the following methods for building authority within a story. Make the reader believe you. Make the incredible seem inevitable. Just really good advice. Use your space. He talks a lot about using the character's body and the way that they would exist in a certain space. We'll get to another interesting example of that now. He says this means, instead of writing about a character, write from within the character. This means that every way the character describes the world must describe the character's experience. You and I never walk into the same room as each other. We each see the room through the lens of our own life. A plumber enters a very different room than a painter enters. That is very useful, in my opinion. I love that example of a plumber and a painter, because of course, based on our experiences in life, we are going to enter a space and have specific thoughts about it that are going to be different from another person entering at the same time as us. I'm trying to think of an example. I don't know. I suddenly can't think of anything. Well, I love interior design, and I love specifically Victorian and Edwardian design. So when I enter maybe like a historic building, then my eyes will just go right to the furniture, and I will be thinking and like scanning and going, that's probably from around the 1870s, that's about 1910, and this blah 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 blah. And this wallpaper is definitely not original, that sort of thing. Whereas if somebody were a contractor or something, they'd be thinking about how expensive it is to do certain renovations on a place that's historic. You can just spiral with this, but it's such good advice, because one thing I also struggle with, and a reason I tend to write things that are kind of one character based and very internal, is that I can't easily differentiate between characters. I feel like I kind of create caricatures when I throw a second and third character into the mix. So this is just good advice to think about how your character would enter a space based on their life experiences. Very, very useful. What is this one? Oh yes, so he writes a lot, Palahniuk writes a lot in first person. but he doesn't want us to use I very much. He says, don't screen the world through your narrator's senses. Instead of writing, I heard the bells ring, write just, the bells rang, or the bells began to ring. Avoid, I saw Ellen, in favor of, Ellen stepped from the crowd. She squared her shoulders and began to walk, each step bringing her closer. So were I your teacher, I'd tell you to write in the first person, but to weed out almost all of your pesky I's. Take that personally, because that is one thing that I've always been marked off or talked to about or noted whatever by my teachers, that I keep doing this thing where I'll say I heard this or I saw this, and clearly if it's in first person, then I am observing those things, and I can leave those parts out. Sometimes I think stylistically it works, but rarely. It usually will just bog down your rating. Okay, so the next section is tension, and he talks about the difference between a clock and a gun. So, and this was so interesting. He's like, he's saying if you don't know how to keep your story paced correctly or how to bring it to a close, if it just kind of keeps going and going, he would say, where's your clock and where's your gun? So the clock is something that limits the story's length, and it's clear and the reader knows the story can't go beyond this point. And the gun is something that can come at any moment that you can use to wrap it up and bring the story to a climax. So for example, you know I have to give a Titanic example, so hang on a second here. Oh, but this is very interesting first. It says Billy Idol gave an interview wherein he commented on why so much punk music sounded the same. The typical punk song started at full throttle, ran for 2.5 minutes, and stopped abruptly. Only when I heard that did I realize how much the punk aesthetic had influenced my writing. This was the reason my best stories began with a jolt, seldom ran over 10 pages, and ended by falling off a cliff. In so many ways I'd internalized the punk clock, a form as rigid as haiku. Loved that, because how many times have I said that my favorite kind of short stories and the ones that I like to write get in, punch you in the face, and just run away. I love the falling off a cliff thing, and that is something that in grad school we had to do this thing where we mapped out the way that we write stories, and I used mountain climbing as my example of a graph, and I had it go up to this pinnacle, here's the climax, and then it just ended, and like I explained, I just want the reader to fall off a cliff. And my teacher was against it. She was polite about it, but that wasn't the way that she liked to write. She was like, why don't you want to have any sort of aftermath? Shouldn't you wrap up the story? And I was like, no, that's not what I like to read. I like stories that are just goodbye. Of course I do like aftermath because I like the satisfaction of knowing what happens, but to me, in a short story especially, it is far more effective and emotionally impactful if you just get out. So I love that he said that, and that's an example of the clock. Okay, so here's the Titanic example of the clock. In every story about the Titanic, the voyage is the clock. To make this clear to everyone in the audience, some stories place a thumbnail, like a summary or primer, on the front of the story. In the film Titanic, for instance, the oceanographers show a computer model of the ship sinking. They give a blow-by-blow description of what's about to happen. That distills the horizontal of the plot so the audience won't be distracted trying to analyze those inevitable events. Very smart. And then, for an example of the gun, it's so conceptual, and I wouldn't think of it this way, but that's why this book is so helpful, because it makes you really think outside the box. In Fight Club and Choke, the gun is the lie told to gain the sympathy of a peer group, the diseased support groups, or the would-be Heimlich maneuverers. When I wanted the story to collapse, I merely had to reveal the main character as a liar and allow his community to redeem or destroy him. Whereas a clock is something obvious and constantly brought to mind, a gun is something you introduce and hide early and hope your audience will forget. When you finally reveal it, you want the gun to feel both surprising and inevitable. So clever. Then the next section is process, and he recommends, as part of your process of writing, going out into public and just listening to people. And this definitely is something that's been useful to me, because writing is such a solitary profession and hobby, and you can tend to just get wrapped up in telling the same story over and over that is just your story and the inside of your head, and you forget what it's like to be around other people, and you forget that other people have thoughts and feelings that are different from your own. So you're shocked when you just go sit at a cafe and listen to some conversations for a while. And the way that people speak will really influence your ability to separate characters and to make things sound more realistic. You know, because if you're a loner like me and you're just sitting around thinking, what would it be like if two people talked to each other, then your dialogue isn't going to sound that realistic and the story is not going to sound that real. So it's important to listen when you're out and about. So he has this part here that is a really fun example. You never know when you'll encounter the remarkable idea, image, remark. The other day I was walking past a construction site where several bricklayers were working on scaffolding while a hod carrier hurried to supply them all with fresh mortar. It looked like a terrible job, running buckets of wet mortar up and down ladders. To show his appreciation, one mason shouted, "Dude, I love the way you keep the mud alive." Isn't that great? And he says this wasn't just the other day, it was 11 years ago, but that's how a wonderful sentence can stick in a writer's mind. So true. I often feel that I'm not truly in the present because I'm always kind of listening for remarkable things that people say that I can then use. But I'm trying to accept that about myself, that like, I just have a writer's brain, and so I analyze things like that the way that maybe an artist's brain would be looking at a sunset and thinking about the colors that they would mix to paint it. I don't know, I'm not a painter, but I assume it's similar. Which, you know, there's nothing wrong with that if you have a creative or an analytical brain, and that's just the way you see the world. You don't have to try and change it. That's what I'm telling myself. Then there's a section on troubleshooting. And he gives you this really helpful setup here that tells you your problems, and then consider this to fix your problem. So problem, a scene runs on and on without contributing to the horizontal or the vertical of the story. So the horizontal is like the time that's going, and the vertical are like the stakes that are raised. Before writing the scene, did you plan its purpose? Does it establish or introduce something? Or does it deepen the risk and tension? Is it a lull to pace an upcoming reveal, or to suggest time passing? Or does it reveal something and resolve tension? Always, always have some inkling of your scene's purpose before you begin to work on it. Smart advice. And there is so much more advice, and I will just be here all day. If I will just read you the whole book and probably go to jail if I do that. So I'm going to show you some of the pictures before we move on to the... Whew, did I just swipe my lipstick across my face? I always have lipstick all over me, and I just don't know why. Anyway, before I get to the personal stuff, I want to show you some of the awesome pictures in here. This one says, "For a thing to endure, it must be made of either granite or words." There are some fabulous quotes in here that are illustrated so beautifully. Just a well-constructed book, I can't say it enough. Really an absolute pleasure to read. I read it like I was reading a thriller. Like, I could not put it down. I was at the gym on the bike, like, I can't get enough of it. And here is "Language is not our first language." Beautiful. Let's see. "No two people ever walk into the same room." And then "You don't write to make friends," which I think is very, very useful, because we can get stuck on, if I write this, this person will hate me because they'll know it's about them. Well, guess what? Too bad. When you meet a reader, it's your turn to listen, which I think is lovely, and I will talk in a moment about some of the interactions that Chuck Palahniuk has had with readers. Okay, so moving on to some of the personal anecdotes that the author shares in this book. The way that he tells stories, it's so strong, and I love how you can see him using all of the advice that he's giving you throughout the book. He's using it in the stories that he's telling you, and you're like, oh, you sneaky, tricky so-and-so. And I don't even think I caught on until there's one point where he's like, did you see what I did there? I'm doing the thing I told you to do. So without reading you like the entire story, I can't really give you the whole effect, but there are certain moments in here that I want to point out that really got to me. There's this bit where he's been seeing a sort of therapist and it's not doing much for him, but then he goes to this tailor or the store to get clothes and he has to get them tailored. And he finds it's extremely relaxing. So he's standing there while the guy measures him and says, I stood with my shoulders back, my chest thrust forward, and my stomach sucked flat. He meant relax. His lips pursed tight to hold a row of straight pins. He chalked the cuffs and pinned the extra fabric between my shoulder blades. To borrow from Craig Clevenger, I felt as if I'd taken a Vicodin. My body felt warm. I relaxed into nothing less than a holly-go-lightly trance. Whatever he was doing, this Russian tailor, pinching the shoulder padding, patting the front to see if the buttons needed to be relocated, I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt this safe. It felt as if nothing bad could happen, not here with the polished wood paneling and houndstooth check, the Madras golf shorts and Shetland sweaters. So, I love this because I also really like this sort of thing, and it's a common ASMR video thing, personal attention, where you're relaxed by things like that, with people taking your measurements or optometrists telling you to like close your eye. I just did like the Obi-Wan Kenobi force thing or whatever. Anyway, so he's trying to figure out why this tailoring is so relaxing to him, and he realizes that it's because of his mother, because his mother made all of his clothes when he was younger and would always stand there taking his measurements. And he has this really interesting part where he's talking about he saw some friends fighting, and he says he rises from his chair during this fight, like everybody else is trying to pretend the fight's not happening, and he's going toward it. It says, my body responded, yearning, drawn forward by some dark nostalgia that the rest of me had forgotten. The shouting, the curses, this fight wasn't one of my parents' many fights, but my body didn't know that. That's so interesting, how the body can remember things, and how subconsciously you're drawn towards something that reminds you of your childhood, even if it's not a pleasant part of childhood. And then he says, your body is a recording device more effective than your mind. One tangible physical detail would elicit another, so on and so on. And after I recognized the magic of the fitting room, it seemed less powerful. The tailor went back to being a guy with a cloth tape measure looped over his shoulders. From here, my brain took over. The reason I'd always avoided buying clothes, even after I could afford to shop at places like Brooks Brothers and Barney's, was because it felt like an insult to wear anything nicer than what our mother could sew. And then this is all kind of a lesson on being on autopilot, and he says like he'd been on this autopilot since his mother had died, just continuing to buy clothes that were cheap and from thrift stores because he didn't want to insult her, but he wasn't doing it consciously. It says, to wear anything nicer, we risked hurting her feelings, so my clothes, even after my success, came from thrift stores. So did my language. Store-bought clothes and $10 words felt pretentious and show-offy, so we bought what we could find secondhand, my siblings and I, and we talked about the weather. And realizing that autopilot tendency set me free. My mother was dead. I could dress up a little. My ideas could grow because my vocabulary could. So if you were my student, I'd tell you to listen to your body as you write. Take note how your hand knows how much coffee is left by the weight of the cup. Tell your stories not simply through your readers' eyes and minds, but through their skin, their noses, their guts, the bottoms of their feet. gorgeous. It's just incredible the way he tells these stories, and they all are so relevant. You know, it's, as much as I would love to read just a straight up memoir by this guy and just hear how his life has gone, the fact that he can weave all of that into something that is useful to teaching about writing is really genius and quite skilled. So anyway, he talks about how somebody, or a lot of people, had wanted him to sign their limbs. I think this is early on when he was touring, and then they would come back to another tour and show him that they'd had the signature tattooed on them. And that's kind of odd, so he decided instead of doing that, he would buy a bunch of fake limbs and sign them for people and give them out at his events. So he would have all these boxes of fake limbs that were sent to the stores before he got there to do his signing. And it says, all my Western tour stops were scheduled by chance just one day after another writer, a man named Aaron Ralston. Despite my label's do not open before Palahniuk book event, most stores were curious and opened the boxes early. Such a stack of mysterious, smelly boxes. They found all the severed arms and thought, this is the most distasteful book promotion we've ever seen. And still not reading my labels, the booksellers went to Aaron when he arrived and told him, you'll be happy to know your severed arms arrived safely. Aaron Ralston, the author of Between a Rock and a Hard Place, the book made into the James Franco film 127 Hours. Yes, that Aaron Ralston, the man who was compelled to cut off his own arm while hiking, who then had to politely tell the bookstore staff that they should read the boxes and that the arms were for Chuck Palahniuk, appearing the next night. Isn't that just wild? The odds, basically every single story he tells, I'm like, what are the odds of that? And I actually have that book on my shelf. I haven't read it yet. I just thought that was wild. And then the bookstore people, somehow assuming I'd known my events, would follow Aaron's, and that I was a deranged joker who'd methodically plotted to harass this other author, just out of my sick sense of humor. When really I'd been doing this for a few years, simply to try and humorlessly dissuade some people from getting a tattoo. I'm really not a tactless dick, but maybe I ought to start to think more things through. So wild. Let's see, we're gonna move ahead. So this is kind of gross, but ends up being really touching. And it's I'll just read it to you. So this guy he comes to his reading and he's talking about how, like, the last person at a book signing is kind of a wild card and you never know what they're gonna do. Like, why have they been lingering to be the last person? This guy takes his clothes off and it says, naked he berated me. You think you're so outlandish? Well, autograph this. And he flopped his pale pink tackle on the table. Skipping ahead, I could see this penis going on Instagram, signed by me. Skin is ridiculously difficult to write on, even more so when it's loose, wrinkled penis skin. People forget that writing books is my job, not autographing thousands of penises. I politely declined. Nothing could have made this last man happier. He snapped, I knew you were a phony, his parting shot. Which leads us to East Lansing, Michigan, and 3 high school kids who waited until the book signing line came to an end at 1 a.m. My flight out of Detroit was in 6 hours and I still needed to get back to my hotel in Ann Arbor, but they pleaded. A friend of theirs had gone out for pizza days before. A drunk driver had T-boned his car, killing the friends he was with and sending him to intensive care in the local hospital. These 3 asked if I'd stop by right now at 1 or 2 in the morning and say hello to him. And no, I won't autograph penises, but I went to the hospital, which was as dim and quiet as any hospital at that hour. The kid had long black Trent Reznor hair. Otherwise, he was pretty well wrapped up in plaster and bandages. His mother sat at his bedside. He didn't die. In fact, I saw him on a later tour, grown up. He'd cut his hair. As I came in and took a seat and started to make small talk with her son, his mom went out in the hallway, where I could still hear her crying. I cried so many times reading this book. You know, not full on, like, sobbing, but I got tears in my eyes from a lot of these anecdotes. Just really powerful stuff, and I love the contrast between that group of last people and the other last person at the signing. And then this is another very touching bit. He's talking about how he sees somebody kind of following him around a store, and he's preparing what very humble thing he's going to say whenever the fan finally says something to him. But then he says that this guy approaches him and he says he was at his reading once, and he said the day before that reading, my brother had died. I was really listening. I was so close to him, the man said. I was in shock, but I had a ticket. I didn't know what else to do. I just went. Those words reduced me to nothing but my ears. I didn't know how I could go on with my life, he said. What to say wasn't an issue. All I could do was listen. And this relates to that part about it's your turn to listen when your readers meet you. I was standing there, the man said, and you gave me a giant stuffed penguin. He smiled. Then I saw that life still had some surprises left. Good things could still happen to me. That got to me a lot. Just that idea of good things can still happen. There are still good things in the world, even after the darkest thing that you've been through. And authors have this power. They have this ability to reach so many people at one time by not even being there, because we can read their books. And I know that I felt that way when I met Stephen Chbosky, who wrote The Perks of Being a Wallflower. That meant so much to me, and he was so down to earth and humble and kind. So that gave me some hope. Not all famous or successful people are totally jaded. I like this little bit about academia versus journalism. In the first writing workshop I attended, we were required to read John Gardner's The Art of Fiction, which we never discussed or referred to in any way, thank God. Its constant references to classic literature were lost on me. I found that most writers fall into one of two camps. The first rise from academia and write gorgeous stuff with very little plot momentum or drive. The second camp of writers emerge from journalism and use simple, clear language to tell stories rich in action and tension. My degree is in journalism, my method journalistic. Which is the opposite of me, because I definitely come from academia, and I have an English degree and a creative writing degree, and read all the classics, and that's just been my education and my interest. And it's funny because my mom has a journalism degree. We both love writing. We have very different styles and different reading styles as well, or different genres that we like to read. So I just liked that. I don't love being part of academia because even for me it is too pretentious, and I considered going on to my PhD and honestly don't know if I could handle it because the people are just so pretentious. So this is the very last couple of sentences. If you were my student, I'd ask you to consider just one more possibility. What if all of our anger and fear is unwarranted? What if world events are unfolding in perfect order to deliver us to a distant joy we can't conceive of at this time? Please consider that the next ending will be the happy one. Highly, highly recommend this book. There are many more unbelievable stories in it. It is packed with valuable writing advice that can actually be applied practically, and it's so clear, and it's just so well structured that you will 100% profit from reading this book. As I said, I think I learned more from this than my master's in creative writing. Truly astounding. I'm at a loss for words. I thought while I was reading it, I was like, I'm just gonna go write like the perfect scene. It's gonna be the best scene, and then I'm gonna put it in a story, and it's gonna be the best story. And haven't done that yet, but maybe I will get back to my long neglected stories. It's definitely inspiring, and yeah, highly, highly recommend. And I think I will go back and revisit some of the Palahniuk books that I read when I was younger, and read some of the few that I still have not yet read. He's a very unique writer with an actual method to his madness, because you can read his books and think, well, this guy's just simply insane. But reading this, I have a whole other perspective. I already liked his writing, and now I understand what an art it is and what a science it is, and I so respect that. So, high praise. Loved it. Thank you all so much for watching. Please let me know your thoughts if you've read this book, your thoughts on other writing advice books that you've read, if you have any recommendations for me. And that's it. I will see you all next time.